The 613 Commandments, Part 20. This Bible study will examine a sample of Torah commandments to see how they would apply to Christians today. We will be using a list of 613 commandments developed by Maimonides and other rabbis as we study the original context of these laws in ancient Israel and consider their connection to the New Testament. We will also correct certain Jewish misinterpretations along the way. In this video, we will cover Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1 through Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 19. You can find the 613 Commandments summary PDF file at the Didactic Ministries website. Commandment 579. Give an ex-wife a certificate of divorce. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1 says, "Suppose a man marries a woman, but she does not please him. Having discovered something wrong with her, he writes a document of divorce, hands it to her, and sends her away from his house. When she leaves his house, she is free to marry another man." This is a general moral command that is taught in the Old and New Testament. God established marriage at creation and expected people to remain married for life. But Moses permitted divorce because people are hard-hearted. There are a few permissible reasons for divorce. In the New Testament, in Matthew chapter 5, verses 31 through 32, Jesus restricted divorce specifically to cases of sexual immorality. Also in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 12 through 16, the Apostle Paul permitted divorce for cases of desertion by an unbelieving spouse. Commandment 580, Regulations on Remarriage to an Ex-Wife. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 3 says, "But if the second husband also turns against her, writes a document of divorce, hands it to her, and sends her away, or if he dies, the first husband may not marry her again, for she has been defiled. That would be detestable to the Lord. You must not bring guilt upon the land the Lord your God is giving you as a special possession." This is a general moral command that applies to everyone. Once a couple divorces and marries another partner, they can never go back to their original spouse. God wants couples to work through their problems and reconcile rather than divorce. But if they choose the path of divorce, they cannot go back together again. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 10 and 11, the Apostle Paul permitted Christian couples to separate for a time in order to cool off and then reconcile, but not divorce. This is an indication of how much God hates divorce. If a person insists on breaking a marriage bond that God has joined together, there is no going back to the original partner. This is detestable in God's sight. Revelation chapter 21, verse 8 makes clear that those who are abominable in the sight of God shall have their part in the lake of fire, which is the second death. Commandment 581, No military service for 1 year after marriage. Commandment 582, No civic duties for 1 year after marriage. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 5 says, "When a man is newly married, he shall not go out with the army, or be liable for any other public duty. He shall be free at home 1 year to be happy with his wife whom he has taken." This is a civil commandment for the Israelite army and for Israel's leaders, and an example for Gentile nations to emulate. The first year of marriage defines the relationship for the rest of the couple's time together. So God wisely gave men a year off from military and civic duty so they could concentrate on their spouse and starting a family. Commandment 583, Don't take a millstone as a pledge. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 6 says, "No one shall take a mill or an upper millstone in pledge, for that would be taking a life in pledge." This is a moral command for Israel and an example for Gentile nations to emulate. It is a specific application of the Golden Rule. The Bible Knowledge Commentary explains, millstones were used daily in homes to grind grain in preparing meals. To take both or one of these as collateral for a debt would in effect deprive a man of his daily bread, that is, his livelihood, and therefore contradict the spirit of generosity which should have motivated the lender in the first place. In our modern world, this would be the same as demanding that a handyman pawn his tools and work van for a loan, or to demand that a restaurant owner pawn his tables, oven, and dishes for a loan. That would deprive him of his ability to earn a living and pay back the loan. Over and over again, we have seen in our study of the Torah that God was protecting the weak and vulnerable in society. Commandment 584, obey the priests regarding cases of leprosy. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 8 says, "Take care, in a case of leprous disease, to be very careful to do according to all that the Levitical priests shall direct you, as I commanded them, so you shall be careful to do." This is a moral command for the Israelites and an example for Gentile nations to emulate. The Hebrew term for leprosy, used in Leviticus chapter 13, covers a broad variety of diseases, molds, and mildew. The priests were the most educated and literate class in ancient Israel, and God's laws about various diseases limited the spread of contagious diseases for a Bronze Age people. We have adapted many of these ancient principles and practices recorded in the Torah into our modern Western world using advanced medical knowledge, personal protective equipment, and pharmaceutical products. But these principles are timeless. Commandment 585, don't enter a borrower's home for a pledge. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 10 says, "When you make your neighbor a loan of any sort, you shall not go into his house to collect his pledge. You shall stand outside, and the man to whom you make the loan shall bring the pledge out to you." This is a moral command for Israel and an example for Gentile nations to emulate. It is also a specific application of the Golden Rule. God wanted the lender to respect the privacy of the needy borrower, who was likely embarrassed about his meager circumstances. Commandment 586, don't keep a borrowed cloak overnight. Commandment 587, restore a borrowed cloak each evening. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 12 says, "And if he is a poor man, you shall not sleep in his pledge. You shall restore to him the pledge as the sun sets, that he may sleep in his cloak and bless you, and it shall be righteousness for you before the Lord your God." This is a moral command for Israel and an example for Gentile nations to emulate. It is also a specific application of the Golden Rule. In this case, the poor man was pawning the last possession that he had, his cloak, which served as his overcoat during the day and as a blanket at night to protect him against the cold and rain. So even though the cloak was collateral for a loan, God ordered the lender to return it to the borrower each night so the poor man could keep warm. God was teaching Israel how to love their neighbor as themselves. Commandment 588, pay laborers their wages on time. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 14 says, "You shall not oppress a hired worker who is poor and needy, whether he is one of your brothers or one of the sojourners who are in your land within your towns. You shall give him his wages on the same day, before the sun sets, for he is poor and counts on it, lest he cry against you to the Lord, and you be guilty of sin." This is a general moral law for all mankind that appears throughout the Old and New Testament. In ancient Israel, the poor would work as day laborers doing farm work, construction, or other manual labor. They lived hand to mouth and depended on getting paid at the end of each day. The rich might be tempted to dock their pay or cheat them out of their wages altogether. Notice what James says in James chapter 5, verse 4. Behold, the pay of the laborers who mowed your fields, which has been withheld by you, cries out against you, and the outcry of those who did the harvesting has reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. Today, we have implemented laws that require employers to pay their employees on a regular schedule, and if they do not pay, they can be taken to court. So in many ways, we have implemented Torah principles in our modern law codes. Commandment 589, only punish the guilty. Deuteronomy 24, verse 16 says, Fathers shall not be put to death because of their children, nor shall children be put to death because of their fathers. Each one shall be put to death for his own sin. This is a civil commandment for Israel's judges and an example for Gentile nations to emulate. God is fair and just. Everyone will answer for their own actions. Notice what is written in Ezekiel chapter 18, verse 20. The soul who sins shall die. The son shall not suffer for the iniquity of the father, nor the father suffer for the iniquity of the son. Also in Matthew chapter 16, verse 27, Jesus said, For the Son of Man will come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and will judge all people according to their deeds. Commandment 590, don't commit injustice against the weak. Commandment 591, don't take a widow's garment in pledge. Deuteronomy 24, verse 17 says, You shall not pervert the justice due to the sojourner or to the fatherless, or take a widow's garment in pledge. But you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore I command you to do this. This is a moral command for Israel and an example for Gentile nations to emulate. It is also a specific application of the Golden Rule. The Israelites were commanded throughout the Torah to take care of the widows among their people. They were not to be lending money to them. They were supposed to be giving charity to the widows. The fact that a widow would have to pawn her garment to get money is an indictment against the Israelites for their lack of charity and taking care of the poor. It is a condemnation of their basic selfish human nature. Commandment 592, leave the forgotten sheaf for the poor. Commandment 593, don't go back for the forgotten sheaf. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 19 says, When you reap your harvest in your field, and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. Verse 22, You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore I command you to do this. Again, this is a moral command for Israel and an example for Gentile nations to emulate, and it is a specific application of the Golden Rule. The poor were able to maintain a measure of dignity because they had to work in order to collect the gleanings of other people in their fields. They didn't have to beg for food or steal in order to survive. They could collect the gleanings that were left over from the harvest of another farmer's field. Commandment 594, judges may punish up to 40 lashes. Commandment 595, judges may not punish beyond 40 lashes. Deuteronomy 25 verse 1 says, If there is a dispute between men, and they come into court, and the judges decide between them, acquitting the innocent and condemning the guilty, then, if the guilty man deserves to be beaten, the judge shall cause him to lie down and be beaten in his presence with a number of stripes in proportion to his offense. 40 stripes may be given him, but not more, lest, if one should go on to beat him with more stripes than these, your brother be degraded in your sight. This is a civil commandment for Israel's leaders and an example for Gentiles to emulate. There were no prisons in Israel. Judges could impose fines, corporal punishment, or the death penalty. Many people focus on God's mercy, but forget that He is also just and does not tolerate sin. In Proverbs chapter 13, verse 24, we read, "Whoever spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is diligent to discipline him." Also in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 6, "For the Lord disciplines the one He loves, and chastises every son whom He receives." So we see that although God is a loving Father, He also punishes His children because He loves them. This may seem harsh to us today, but we have to remember that God will ultimately condemn every unrepentant sinner to hell fire. Commandment 596, don't muzzle an ox treading out the grain. Deuteronomy 25, verse 4 says, "You shall not muzzle an ox when it is treading out the grain." This is a moral commandment for Israelite farmers and an example for Gentile nations. A wise farmer would let his animal eat as he is treading out the grain, but a greedy man would work his animal to death just to get a little extra grain out of the harvest. However, Paul shows us that there is a broader spiritual principle at work here. In Proverbs chapter 12, verse 10, we read, "Whoever is righteous has regard for the life of his beast, but the mercy of the wicked is cruel." In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 9 through 11, the Apostle Paul used this Torah commandment to explain that the ministry deserves support from the congregation in exchange for their spiritual service which they render to others. Commandment 597, perform the duty of levirate marriage. Commandment 598, produce an heir by levirate marriage. Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 5 says, "If brothers dwell together, and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go in to her and take her as his wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And the first son, whom she bears, shall succeed to the name of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out of Israel." This is a moral command for Israelites and an example for Gentile nations. In ancient Israel, the clan took care of needy family members, and arranged marriages were the norm. A childless widow would be left destitute without this custom of levirate marriage. Today, however, modern Western culture has developed universal compulsory education and social welfare programs that have eliminated the need for this custom. The Bible contains a beautiful story of levirate marriage. In Ruth chapters 3 and 4, we see that Boaz married Ruth, the Moabitess, as a kinsman redeemer, and because of this marriage, King David was born, and ultimately Jesus Christ came from this lineage. Commandment 599, an option to decline a levirate marriage. Deuteronomy 25, verse 7 says, "And if the man does not wish to take his brother's wife, then his brother's wife shall go up to the gate to the elders and say, 'My husband's brother refuses to perpetuate his brother's name in Israel. He will not perform the duty of a husband's brother to me.' Then the elders of his city shall call him and speak to him. And if he persists, saying, 'I do not wish to take her,' Then his brother's wife shall go up to him in the presence of the elders and pull his sandal off his foot and spit in his face. And she shall answer and say, So shall it be done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. In ancient Israel, arranged marriages were the norm, but even an arranged marriage had to be mutually agreeable, or it could be called off, and a different arrangement was found by other clan members. Ruth chapters 3 and 4 point out that Boaz was not the nearest kinsman redeemer for Ruth, but because he wanted the job, his relative stepped aside and let him take Ruth as his wife. Commandment 600, punish a woman who grabs a man's genitals. Commandment 601, have no pity executing judgment. Deuteronomy chapter 25 verse 11 says, When men fight with one another, and the wife of the one draws near to rescue her husband from the hand of him who is beating him, and puts out her hand and seizes him by the private parts, then you shall cut off her hand. Your eye shall have no pity. This is a civil command for Israelite judges and an example for Gentiles to emulate. The Bible Knowledge Commentary explains this passage in the following way. The commandment in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 11 and 12, was probably intended to protect both womanly modesty and the capacity of a man to produce heirs. This second purpose probably helps explain why this law is placed here immediately after the instructions about levirate marriages. Deuteronomy chapter 13 verse 8, chapter 19 verse 13, and chapter 19 verse 21 also use this expression, your eye shall have no pity. So this is the fourth time in the book of Deuteronomy that Moses told Israel to show no pity. We have to remember that loving God with our whole heart sometimes means being ruthless with sin. Commandment 602, don't use dishonest weights to swindle. Deuteronomy chapter 25 verse 13 says, You shall not have in your bag 2 kinds of weights, a large and a small. You shall not have in your house 2 kinds of measures, a large and a small. A full and fair weight you shall have. A full and fair measure you shall have, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. For all who do such things, all who act dishonestly, are an abomination to the Lord your God. This is a general moral command that is taught throughout the Old and New Testament. In ancient Israel, merchants would weigh out products on a balance, and a wicked man would keep 2 sets of weights in order to cheat his customers. Or he would have 2 kinds of measures, a light and a heavy, so that he could cheat his customers in a business transaction. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 9 and 10 clearly tell us that thieves and swindlers will not inherit the kingdom of God. Commandment 603, remember what Amalek did to you. Commandment 604, never forget what Amalek did to you. Commandment 605, exterminate the Amalekites. Deuteronomy chapter 25 verse 17 says, Remember what Amalek did to you on the way as you came out of Egypt, how he attacked you on the way when you were faint and weary, and cut off your tail, those who were lagging behind you. And he did not fear God. Therefore, when the Lord your God has given you rest from all your enemies around you, in the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance to possess, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. You shall not forget. This is a civil command for Israelite leaders that has been fulfilled. King Saul failed to destroy Amalek, but later generations succeeded. 1 Chronicles chapter 4, verses 42 and 43 say that 500 Simeonites wiped out the last of the Amalekites. This would have occurred around the year 700 BC. The book of Esther, chapter 3, verse 1, and chapter 3, verse 6, introduce into the story a man named Haman, the son of Hammedatha, an Agagite, who wanted to destroy all of the Jews. Although many people believed that Haman was descended from King Agag of the Amalekites, other scholars believe that Haman was not an Amalekite. Commandment 606, make a declaration with your firstfruits offering. Deuteronomy chapter 26, verse 1 says, when you enter the land that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, and you take possession of it and settle in it, you are to take some of the firstfruits of all your produce from the soil of the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and put them in a basket. Then go to the place the Lord your God will choose as a dwelling for his name, to the priest who is serving at that time, and say to him, I declare today to the Lord your God that I have entered the land that the Lord swore to our fathers to give us. This command specifically applies to the Israelites living in the promised land. However, it serves as an example for Gentiles to emulate. An offering is an expression of gratitude to our Creator for all the blessings that he gives to us. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 9 says, honor the Lord from your wealth and from the first of all of your produce. So giving an offering to God is an act of gratitude, and it is appropriate for all people to show gratitude to our great Creator God. Commandment 607, make a declaration with your third tithe offering. Deuteronomy chapter 26, verse 12 says, when you have finished laying aside a tenth of all your produce in the third year, the year of the tithe, you are to give it to the Levite, the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, that they may eat and be filled within your gates. Then you shall declare in the presence of the Lord your God, I have removed from my house the sacred portion, and have given it to the Levite, the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, according to all the commandments you have given me. I have not transgressed or forgotten your commandments. This commandment applies to Israelites living in the promised land and is an example for Gentile nations to emulate. The Israelites would tithe a third tithe in the third and sixth years of a 7-year cycle. They would take this tithe and lay it up within the gates of their cities, and the elders would distribute that food to the poor of the land. Today, modern nations have social welfare programs that fulfill the spirit of this third tithe law. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 27 says, do not withhold good from those to whom it is due, when it is in your power to do it. So today, we have social welfare programs that implement the spirit of these Torah commandments. Commandment 608, don't eat the sacred portion while in mourning. Commandment 609, don't eat the sacred portion while unclean. Commandment 610, don't offer the sacred portion for the dead. Continuing this theme of a declaration during the third tithe year, Deuteronomy chapter 26, verse 14 says, I have not eaten any of the sacred portion while in mourning, or removed any of it while unclean, or offered any of it for the dead. I have obeyed the Lord my God. I have done everything you commanded me. Look down from your holy habitation, from heaven, and bless your people Israel and the land you have given us, as you swore to our fathers, a land flowing with milk and honey. This is a general moral command that applied to Israelites and resident aliens alike, but is currently in abeyance. No one is allowed to eat a sacrificial offering while they are unclean due to the death of a family member, which is why God allowed the Israelites to celebrate the Passover in the second month of the Hebrew calendar. Numbers chapter 15, verse 14 explicitly say that Israelites and Gentiles must follow the same regulations for a sacrificial offering. In Leviticus chapter 20, verse 23, God warned the Israelites not to copy the pagan religious practices of the Canaanites, such as making offerings to the dead. This likely refers to some form of ancestor worship or necromancy, which is similar to our modern festival of Halloween. Galatians chapter 5, verses 19 through 21 clearly teach that those who practice paganism and sorcery will not inherit God's kingdom. Commandment 611, keep God's commandments and walk in his ways. Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 9 says, "The Lord will establish you as a people holy to himself, as he has sworn to you, if you keep the commandments of the Lord your God and walk in his ways." This is a general moral command that is taught throughout the Old and New Testament. Technically, this passage is a promise rather than a command, but it is an essential truth that must be acknowledged by everyone. Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 13 says, "When all has been heard, the conclusion of the matter is this: fear God and keep his commandments, because this is the whole duty of man." In Matthew chapter 4, verse 4, Jesus answered the devil and said, "It is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." Commandment 612, assemble the people to hear the Torah. Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 10 says, "And Moses commanded them, at the end of every 7 years, at the set time in the year of release, at the Feast of Booths, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God at the place that he will choose, you shall read this law before all Israel in their hearing. Assemble the people, men, women, and little ones, and the sojourner within your towns, that they may hear and learn to fear the Lord your God, and be careful to do all the words of this law." This is a general command that applied to Israelites and resident aliens alike. God expects all people to learn about his word, to understand his commandments, to fear him, and to obey him. In Acts chapter 20, verse 27, the Apostle Paul said, "I did not shrink from declaring to you the whole counsel of God." In 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 2, the Apostle Paul exhorted his protege Timothy, "Preach the word, be ready in season and out of season, reprove, rebuke, and exhort with complete patience and teaching." And so we see that the ministry is responsible for teaching the Word of God to the people, and the Apostle Paul certainly set an example of doing just that. Commandment 613, teach the song of Moses to Israel. Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 19 says, "Now therefore, write this song and teach it to the people of Israel. Put it in their mouths, that this song may be a witness for me against the people of Israel." This is a moral command for Israel to follow and an example for Gentile nations to remember. God predicted that Israel would backslide, be destroyed, and return from exile to the land that he had given them, which is exactly what happened. God is not a respecter of persons. He judges each person fairly and justly. The Apostle Paul warned Christians in the New Testament with a similar message. In Colossians chapter 3, verse 25, Paul wrote, "But if you do what is wrong, you will be paid back for the wrong you have done, for God has no favorites." As we conclude this study of the 613 Torah commandments, I think it is fitting that we close with a passage from the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 12, verses 13 and 14. "When all has been heard, the conclusion of the matter is this: fear God and keep his commandments, because this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment, along with every hidden thing, whether good or evil."